It all began with the sound of a socket wrench clicking in the late afternoon sun. The driveway was warm, the air filled with the smell of oil and old metal, and the satisfaction of tightening the last bolt on a stubborn. Axel gave a sense of peace no HOA letter could ever provide. At least that's what he thought. The truck sat proudly in the driveway, a beast of steel and grease, the kind of machine that stood as both a vehicle and a statement. For the owner, working on it wasn't just about repairs. It was about keeping alive a ritual, a connection with machines that had carried him through life. But in neighborhoods governed by power-hungry homeowners associations, personal satisfaction rarely mattered. What mattered to them were appearances, rules, and the illusion of control. The letter appeared on the front door later that evening, folded neatly but laced with hostility. In bold, accusatory text, the HOA informed him that mechanical work in public view violated community standards. A fine had been assessed, not a warning, not a courtesy notice, just a direct financial penalty. They had skipped straight to punishment, assuming compliance would follow without resistance. For a moment there was laughter. After all, he wasn't just any neighbor tinkering under a shade tree. He was a licensed mechanic, the owner of a repair shop that had operated for years, serving half the community already. His work in the driveway wasn't negligence or a hobby, it was skill, livelihood, and precision. But to the HOA, none of that mattered. They saw a truck on jack stands, grease stains on concrete, and in their minds, that was enough to trigger their hunger for authority. Behind the letter was more than just annoyance. It was the beginning of a pattern. HOAs thrive on control, and often their leaders are fueled not by the desire to maintain order, but by ego, spite, and the intoxicating taste of power. The board in this particular neighborhood was no different. They had long watched the mechanic with suspicion, whispering about his independence, about how he never attended their meetings, never bowed to their petty regulations. To them, the fine was not just about a truck. It was about breaking someone they couldn't control. Neighbors noticed the confrontation, though none dared intervene. For some, it was amusement. For others, sympathy. They knew the HOA well enough to recognize this was only the opening move. The mechanic, however, didn't see the fine as a loss. Instead, he saw it as an opportunity. The board had made a mistake in targeting him. In their attempt to show power, they had overlooked one key fact. Every one of them depended on their cars, and every car depended on someone like him. That night, under the dim light of his garage, he cleaned his tools with slow, deliberate movements. He thought of the arrogance in their letter, the smugness hidden in bureaucratic wording. To the HOA, this was a victory, a tightening of the leash around one homeowner's neck. To him, it was the sound of a challenge being issued. In the days that followed, he noticed the subtle changes. HOA board members drove by slower, watching him, expecting compliance. The fines escalated in frequency, each one higher than the last, each one paired with language-threatening legal action. They believed they were turning the screws, forcing him into submission. But instead, he was sharpening his plans, waiting patiently, letting them dig their own hole. The real twist began when one of the board members' cars broke down. It was inevitable. Machines fail, and timing has a cruel sense of humor. The irony was thick when the very people who fined him for fixing his own truck had no choice but to seek his expertise. For years, his shop had been the most reliable in town, and their cars had been through his hands before. But this time, things would not go as smoothly. The mechanic did not chase revenge with anger. Instead, he waited with calm precision. He knew the moment was coming when their desperation would meet his opportunity. And when that moment arrived, it would no longer be about fines, rules, or authority. It would be about survival in the real world, where grease, tools, and engines carried more weight than any clipboard or petty regulation. The first fine, though written on cheap paper, had set in motion something the HOA couldn't predict. They thought they had cornered him. In truth, they had just given him the blueprint for their undoing. And as the week passed, the parking lot of his shop was destined to look very different. The HOA board, once proud of their power, was about to line up like customers waiting for service. But service this time would come at a price. The fine was not the end of the fight. It was the spark. And sparks, when handled by someone who understands engines, always lead to fire. The first fine had been nothing more than paper, ink scrawled, by people who thought power. Came from signatures and bylaws. But in the real world, power was measured in torque, fuel, and the hum of a machine that carried someone from point A to point B. The HOA board had forgotten that their neatly pressed blazers and smug smiles were useless without cars to drive them to work, to social gatherings, to their precious committee meetings. And like all machines, their cars were bound to fail. The first breakdown came quietly. One board member's luxury sedan began to sputter on the way home from the grocery store. A faint whining from the engine grew louder, until the vehicle shuddered to a stop in a gas station parking lot. Air's SUV stalled in the morning rush. Its transmission slipped, grinding loudly as though mocking its owner's authority. Once again, Callswimmer, the owner, proud and arrogant in every HOA meeting, suddenly found himself stranded, helpless, and clutching a phone with shaking hands. The irony was sharp. The only mechanic he trusted, the only one who could handle high-end European cars in the area, was the same neighbor he had voted to fine just days earlier. But pride was a stubborn disease. The board member called another shop miles away begging for service. The answer was predictable: no availability for weeks, astronomical costs, and no guarantee the parts would even arrive in time. Slowly, reality settled in. The mechanic they had tried to humiliate was not just an option. He was the only option. The sedan was eventually towed to the mechanic's shop under the cover of dusk, as if secrecy could shield the shame. No words were exchanged, just a nervous drop of the keys and a muttered explanation about unavoidable circumstances. The mechanic accepted them without expression. He did not need to gloat. The real satisfaction came in knowing this was only the beginning. Days later, another board member, and once again, other shops turned them away or quoted absurd repair times. And once again, the HOA's self-appointed enforcer of rules found herself parking in front of the very garage she had once complained about. It wasn't just coincidence. Cars age, parts wear, and breakdowns are inevitable. But what made the situation almost poetic was the timing. Within 2 weeks, half the HOA board experienced mechanical failures: an overheating engine, a dead alternator, a locked-up brake system. Each problem different, each one a reminder that beneath their polished appearances, they were just as vulnerable as anyone else. For the mechanic, there was no need for sabotage or schemes. The laws of machinery worked in his favor. Engines did not respect bylaws, and transmissions didn't care about fines. The HOA had built its power on the illusion of control. But machines exposed the truth. They were all dependent, and their survival on the road was in his hands. At the shop, the dynamic shifted. Cars from the HOA lined up outside, their proud owners forced to walk through doors they had once considered beneath them. There were no HOA clipboards here, no smug letters on the mechanic's counter. Here, the rules were different. Here, the mechanic was in charge. Repairs were done with precision, but not with mercy. Labor rates doubled for every board member. Parts were sourced slowly, with timelines stretched thin. What was once a quick repair became a waiting game, leaving HOA members carless, forced to beg for rides, and exposed to the very neighbors they tried to intimidate. The same people who had once nodded approvingly when fines were announced now whispered behind hands, laughing at the sudden humility of the board. The mechanic never explained his reasoning. He didn't need to. The board members knew the truth. They had created this situation themselves. By targeting the man who could have been their greatest ally, they had instead made themselves his unwilling customers. And still, the HOA pressed forward with arrogance. More fines appeared, citing prolonged vehicle storage, unsightly oil stains, and business operations within a residential area. Each letter was more aggressive than the last, their words sharp with desperation. But the mechanic had something stronger than defiance. He had leverage. Behind closed doors, the board grew restless. Meetings stretched late into the night, their discussions filled with frustration. They wanted to crush the mechanic, to strip him of his livelihood. But with each passing week, their dependence grew. Their cars were in his shop. Their lives stalled until he chose to hand them back. And every invoice he handed over was a reminder that power no longer belonged to them. The neighborhood noticed. Whispers turned into open conversations. Residents who had once feared the HOA began to laugh openly at their hypocrisy. The board, once untouchable, was now seen limping to carpools, waiting for public transportation, and apologizing to neighbors they had once scolded. The balance of power had shifted quietly, and the mechanic hadn't needed to lift a finger beyond his usual work. But beneath the surface, tension simmered. The HOA board could not stand humiliation. They were losing not just their authority, but their image, and in their world, image was everything. Pride pushed them to scheme harder, to find new ways to strike back. What they didn't realize was that every attempt only dug them deeper. As the weeks rolled on, the mechanic continued his work with steady hands and calm patience. He did not need to rush revenge. It was unfolding naturally, written in grease and broken engines. For every fine they issued, another car limped into his garage. For every threat they penned, another invoice drained their wallets. The cracks in their engines mirrored the cracks in their power. The HOA's foundation was failing, and the board members could feel it. Control was slipping, respect was eroding, and their carefully curated authority was rusting like the undercarriage of a neglected vehicle. The mechanic knew this was just the beginning. Their desperation would not stop here. Pride would push them into making mistakes, into overreaching, into attempting one last power move. And when that moment came, he would be ready. The first fine had lit the spark. The breakdowns had fanned the flames. But the real fire, the one that would consume the HOA's grip on power entirely, was still waiting to ignite. The sound of engines failing had become the quiet background. Music of the neighborhood. Cars stalled in driveways, broke down on side streets, and limped into the mechanic's shop with their owners, pride trailing behind them like exhaust smoke. The board members, once untouchable figures in their little kingdom, now stood exposed as ordinary people desperate for repairs. Yet humiliation alone was never enough to keep prideful egos subdued. The HOA board was furious. The mechanic's invoices had drained their wallets. His slow timelines had stranded them, and his steady indifference had become unbearable. In their meetings, bitterness filled the air. They spoke of sending a message, of making an example, of showing the neighborhood that the board, not some greasy-handed mechanic, held the true power. The solution they chose was escalation. Letters began arriving with new threats. No longer simple fines, but bold warnings of legal consequences. The board claimed his work in the driveway violated zoning laws, that his garage was being used for unauthorized commercial purposes. They drafted letters filled with exaggerated claims of noise, pollution, and unsightliness. Each envelope dripped with the arrogance of people who believed paperwork could bend reality to their will. But the mechanic was patient. He read every line, filed every letter, and watched as their desperation grew. He understood something the board didn't. Laws were not as malleable as HOA rules. Regulations required evidence, proof, and legitimacy, and the board had none. Still, they pressed on. Soon, the HOA sent formal complaints to the city, demanding an investigation. They portrayed him as a nuisance, a lawbreaker, a threat to property values. Inspectors arrived, clipboards in hand, walking the property, measuring noise levels, checking permits. The board members watched eagerly from a distance, expecting to see the mechanic's empire collapse under the weight of bureaucracy. But reality once again refused to bend to their will. The inspectors found nothing unlawful. The mechanic's work was contained within his rights. His shop downtown was licensed. His garage at home was private, and no rules prevented him from repairing his own vehicle in his own driveway. The city's report was short and clear, no violations detected. The board's smug smiles evaporated the moment they read the report. Their attempt to crush him with legal weight had backfired, leaving them looking both powerless and petty. The neighborhood, once quiet observers, now openly mocked the board's failure. The mechanic had not needed to lift a finger in defense. The system they tried to weaponize had simply told them no. But humiliation breeds anger, and anger fuels reckless decisions. The board doubled down, creating new HOA rules overnight, tailored specifically to target him. They banned visible vehicle maintenance, imposed curfews for noise, and required approval for all structural modifications, including sheds and garages. These rules, passed hastily and without proper procedure, were riddled with flaws. But to the board, it didn't matter. What mattered was control, the ability to hold something over him, even if temporary. Yet every new rule only weakened them further. Neighbors, already frustrated by the board's arrogance, began to speak out. Some had enjoyed the mechanic's help for years, bringing their cars to his shop and trusting his skills. Others simply despised the constant meddling of the HOA. Now, seeing the board waste time and money on personal vendettas, they began to turn against their so-called leaders. Rumors spread quickly. Whispers of corruption, favoritism, and personal grudges circulated through the community. The mechanic's story became a symbol of resistance, proof that the HOA was not invincible. Families who had once cowered under threats of fines now felt emboldened, questioning every rule, every fee, every demand the board made. Meanwhile, the mechanic continued his quiet work. Cars from the board trickled in, each one an emblem of hypocrisy. Their threats continued on paper, but their keys still landed on his counter. He repaired their vehicles with the same steady hands, handed over invoices that grew steeper with every visit, and watched as they left, with forced politeness masking their humiliation. The board was trapped in a cycle of their own making. They needed him, but they hated him. They wanted to destroy him, but every attempt only strengthened his position. They believed they were playing chess, moving pieces strategically across a board. But in truth, they were pawns in a much larger game, one they didn't even understand. Then came the turning point. One board member, desperate to regain control, made a critical mistake. She attempted to file a lawsuit against the mechanic personally, accusing him of running an illegal business from his home. The papers were served with dramatic flair, as though she had finally landed the blow that would bring him down. But lawsuits are not HOA fines. They are expensive, slow, and unforgiving. The mechanic, calm and prepared, handed the papers directly to his lawyer, a longtime friend and client who had driven countless miles in cars, repaired by his hands. The lawyer smiled at the absurdity of the claims and prepared a counterstrike. Within weeks, the case was thrown out. Worse, the board member was slapped with court fees, her reckless filing deemed baseless and wasteful. The humiliation was public, documented, and undeniable. For the mechanic, it was more than a victory. It was the beginning of the unraveling. The board's attempt to wield the law had backfired spectacularly. Their authority, once unquestioned, was crumbling under the weight of their own arrogance. And yet the mechanic knew this was not the end. Desperation makes people dangerous. Pride blinds them to reason. The HOA would not stop until they had exhausted every option, every tactic, every ounce of influence they believed they had. But the more they fought, the more they exposed themselves. The neighborhood was watching. The city was aware. The law was not on their side, and every day their cars reminded them of the truth. The man they had tried to crush was the one keeping them moving. The board had made their move. The mechanic had countered with patience, but the game was far from over. And the next round would determine whether the HOA could survive its own self-inflicted wounds. The spark had become fire, and soon, the flames would engulf everything they thought they controlled. By the time the baseless lawsuit collapsed, the HOA's authority had already begun to rust like an old chassis left too long in the rain. The neighborhood was watching more closely now. Neighbors who once bowed, their heads in silence whenever fines were mentioned, were beginning to ask questions. What had started as a petty grudge against one man was unraveling into something bigger, something the board could no longer control. The mechanic understood this shift. He had not shouted, not protested, not marched door to door with complaints. Instead, he had waited. He had let the HOA expose themselves, let their arrogance play out in public. Now, with the community turning restless and the board weakened, it was time to tighten the bolts and make his move. It began subtly. Conversations with neighbors over fences, quiet nods in the grocery store parking lot, a smile exchanged when he handed back a repaired car. People were curious, emboldened, and ready to talk. Stories came pouring out, accounts of unfair fines, favoritism, board members using HOA funds for personal landscaping, shady accounting with community dues. The mechanic listened carefully, storing every detail like a diagram of an engine. The more he heard, the clearer the picture became. The HOA board was not just arrogant. They were corrupt. Their obsession with power had blinded them, and in their desperation to crush him, they had exposed cracks in their entire operation. But information alone was not enough. Timing mattered. Just like fixing a truck, success required precision, the right tool, the right angle, and the right moment. The mechanic understood patience better than anyone. Engines taught him that rushing only made things worse. He would wait until the board's wheels were wobbling so badly that one final twist would send them spinning off completely. Meanwhile, the board continued to stumble. Their rules grew more absurd, banning small decorative items, policing lawn lengths, and demanding new fees. Each rule felt personal, as though they were flailing against a tide they could no longer control. Each fine they issued seemed less like discipline and more like desperation. And with each move, the neighborhood grew louder. Homeowners grumbled at meetings, questioned the rising costs, and openly mocked the board's hypocrisy. They knew who kept their cars running. They knew who had stood firm against the harassment. The mechanic's quiet resilience was becoming a rallying point, a reminder that the HOA's power only existed if people allowed it. The turning point came when one of the mechanic's invoices, doubled in rate for an HOA board member's repair, became public knowledge. It wasn't leaked. Maliciously, it was mentioned, casually at a neighborhood gathering, a slip of the tongue born of frustration. But once people heard it, they laughed. The image of the board being forced to pay extra to the very man they tried to ruin spread like wildfire. The humiliation was no longer private. It was communal entertainment. The mechanic hadn't planned this revelation, but he understood its value immediately. The board was bleeding credibility. They could fine him endlessly, but every time their cars broke down, and they always would, he remained their only choice. Their pride was being drained one invoice at a time, and everyone knew it. With the neighborhood now openly questioning the board's authority, the mechanic made his next move. He began gathering the complaints, the stories of misuse, the financial irregularities. He didn't do it loudly. He didn't stand on a soapbox. He simply collected, documented, and prepared. The neighbors, tired of the board's antics, were more than willing to help. They handed him copies of letters, records of fines, and even receipts that didn't add up. Piece by piece, the picture grew clearer. The board wasn't just overreaching, they were breaking their own bylaws. When the evidence was ready, the mechanic didn't storm into a meeting waving papers. Instead, he waited for the perfect setting, a quarterly HOA meeting, open to all residents. The board expected it to be business as usual, with their rules passed unchallenged and their authority unshaken. But this time, the room was different. The seats were full. Neighbors who rarely attended showed up, arms crossed, eyes sharp, waiting. The mechanic sat quietly until the moment arrived. When the board attempted to push through another round of fines and new restrictions, he raised his hand. Calmly, steadily, he spoke. Not with anger, but with precision. He laid out the inconsistencies, the misuse of funds, the illegal rewriting of bylaws. He spoke of the city inspector's clean report, of the baseless lawsuit that had cost residents money, of the hypocrisy of board members, finding him while bringing their own cars to his shop. The room shifted instantly. Neighbors leaned forward, murmuring in agreement, nodding, even laughing when he described the doubled invoices. The board members squirmed in their seats, their polished confidence melting under the heat of collective scrutiny. For the first time, the mechanic had turned their own weapon against them, not with threats, but with facts. And facts, once spoken aloud, could not be fined, could not be silenced, could not be buried under paperwork. The meeting ended in chaos. Residents shouted for answers, demanded accountability, called for resignations. The board, once smug and untouchable, now looked cornered, desperate and outnumbered. The mechanic left quietly, slipping away as the noise escalated. He didn't need to linger. He had turned the wrench, and now the whole machine was shaking. At home, he returned to his tools, wiping grease from his hands with the same calm patience that had carried him this far. He knew the board wouldn't give up easily. Pride would push them to fight, to cling to whatever scraps of power remained. But now, the neighborhood was no longer on their side. The balance had shifted completely. The mechanic was no longer just a target of their fines. He had become the symbol of their downfall. The fire was spreading, and soon, the board's empire of paper and signatures would collapse under its own weight. The meeting had ended in chaos, but the ripple effects were only just beginning. The mechanic had left quietly, fading into the background as neighbors demanded answers. But the damage had been done. The board, once united in smug authority, was beginning to fracture under the weight of exposure. In the days that followed, the silence in the neighborhood felt different. It wasn't the silence of compliance anymore. It was the silence of watching, waiting and whispering. Neighbors exchanged knowing glances as board members walked past. Conversations stopped when they approached, and the once feared figures of power now felt like intruders in their own kingdom. Behind closed doors, the board turned on itself. Meetings that once echoed with certainty now dissolved into arguments. Accusations flew like sparks from a grinding wheel. One member demanded to know who had approved the lawsuit that cost them thousands. Another blamed the treasurer for sloppy accounting. A third accused the president of targeting the mechanic out of personal spite rather than community interest. The unity that had fueled their arrogance was gone. They were no longer a board. They were a collection of desperate individuals, scrambling to protect themselves. And all the while, the mechanic said nothing. He didn't need to. He kept repairing cars, kept greeting neighbors with quiet nods, kept letting the weight of their own mistakes pull them apart. Like an engine left without oil, the board was seizing up on its own. The financial cracks widened quickly. Residents began questioning where their dues had gone. Rumors of misused funds became louder. Fueled by receipts and documents, the mechanic had carefully encouraged neighbors to bring forward landscaping projects that seemed overpriced, community events that never materialized, sudden administrative fees that no one could explain. All of it came under scrutiny. When homeowners demanded transparency, the board faltered. Their excuses sounded weak, their explanations contradictory. Each attempt to cover one lie only revealed another, and the mechanic, ever patient, watched as their credibility corroded like rust eating through steel. Then came the resignations. The first to go was the treasurer, a nervous man who couldn't withstand the pressure of scrutiny. When neighbors pressed him for answers about missing funds, he cracked, claiming he had only been following orders. He resigned abruptly, leaving the rest of the board scrambling to contain the fallout. Next was a secretary, tired of being blamed for poor communication, unwilling to shoulder responsibility for decisions she hadn't made. Her resignation letter was short and sharp, accusing the remaining board members of corruption and incompetence. Each departure weakened the board further, exposing the rot at its core. What had once been a united front of authority was now a crumbling structure, collapsing under its own weight. The president of the HOA, the loudest critic of the mechanic, refused to step down. Pride anchored her in place, even as the foundation around her disintegrated. She clung to the belief that she could still win, still crush the man she saw as her enemy, but every move she made only revealed more weakness. The mechanic, meanwhile, became a quiet hero in the neighborhood. Neighbors who had once avoided him now sought him out, offering kind words, dropping off food, and even volunteering to help around his shop. They saw him not just as a mechanic, but as proof that the HOA could be challenged, that their reign of intimidation could be broken. The shift in power was undeniable. What had started with one fine had grown into a full-scale collapse of authority. The board, once feared, was now ridiculed. Their meetings were sparsely attended, their letters openly mocked, their rules ignored. Homeowners no longer trembled when an envelope appeared in their mailbox. Instead, they laughed, tossing fines into the trash, knowing the board lacked the strength to enforce them. The president tried one last desperate move. She called for an emergency vote to rewrite the bylaws, seeking sweeping powers to enforce compliance. But when the meeting convened, the room was full not with supporters, but with angry residents demanding her resignation. Her attempt at control ended in public humiliation as the crowd shouted her down, refusing to grant her the authority she craved. The mechanic didn't even attend. He didn't need to. His presence wasn't required for the board to collapse. It was collapsing under the weight of its own arrogance. By the end of the month, the HOA was in shambles. Only 2 board members remained, clinging to titles that now meant nothing. Their threats carried no weight, their rules no longer respected. The neighborhood had shifted, united not under fear, but under shared defiance. The mechanic's role was never loud, never theatrical. He hadn't needed to raise his voice or stage a rebellion. He had simply lived, worked, and waited while the board destroyed itself. And now, as he stood in his driveway, wiping grease from his hands, he knew the fight was nearly over. But he also knew prideful people rarely go quietly. The president, stubborn and desperate, was not finished yet. Her obsession with control would push her into one final act, one last attempt to claw back authority. And when she did, it would not just seal her fate, it would cement the mechanic's victory forever. The engine of the HOA was already sputtering. Soon it would stall completely. The board had been reduced to fragments. Resignations had gutted its structure. Neighbors no longer respected its rules. And the once feared authority of the HOA was now little more than a hollow shell. Yet even in ruin, pride clung stubbornly to the last remaining leader. The president of the HOA refused to surrender. She had watched her allies abandon their posts, had felt the sting of public humiliation, and had endured the whispers that followed her wherever she walked. But instead of reflecting, she turned to rage. She saw the mechanic not just as a neighbor, but as the architect of her downfall. Every lost dollar, every angry resident, every smirk behind her back, all of it. She believed, traced back to him. Pride is a dangerous fuel, and it drove her into one last desperate attempt at control. She began with a letter, not the usual fine or warning, but a declaration. In it, she claimed the mechanic's property was in violation of multiple bylaws, citing everything from the color of his garage door to the presence of tools in his driveway. She demanded immediate compliance under threat of foreclosure, wielding the most extreme measure the HOA possessed. The letter spread quickly through the neighborhood. Residents gasped, not in fear but in disbelief. The board, crippled and ridiculed, was now threatening to take a man's home over imagined violations. What once might have inspired silence now sparked outrage. Neighbors rallied, voices rising in defense of the mechanic. They saw the letter for what it was, the last, bitter swing of someone who had already lost. The mechanic, calm as ever, did not flinch. He filed the letter neatly alongside the others, a growing archive of arrogance and failure. Then, with the same steady patience that had carried him through every battle, he prepared his response. He didn't need anger. He didn't need revenge. What he had was something far more powerful, evidence. At the next community meeting, the room was packed. Homeowners filled every seat, lined the walls, and stood shoulder to shoulder. The atmosphere was electric, not with fear, but with anticipation. They knew the mechanic had something, and they were ready to hear it. When the president attempted to open the meeting with her usual authority, she was drowned out by murmurs and whispers. The mechanic rose, calm and steady, holding a folder thick with documents. He spoke only once, but his words carried more weight than all her years of bluster. He laid out the evidence, financial records showing misused dues, receipts for personal expenses charged to the HOA, inconsistencies in bylaws rewritten without proper votes. He showed copies of the city's inspection report, clearing his property of any violations. He revealed the frivolous lawsuit that had wasted money and credibility. And then, with quiet precision, he displayed the foreclosure threat, a document so extreme and unfounded it silenced the room. The effect was immediate. Gasps filled the air, followed by outrage. Homeowners shouted for accountability, demanded resignation, and called for a vote of no confidence. The president, pale and trembling, tried to speak, but her words were drowned out by the storm she had created. The mechanic didn't gloat. He didn't need to. He simply set the documents on the table, stepped back, and let the weight of truth do the work. The vote came swiftly. By overwhelming majority, the president was removed from her position. Her threats, her arrogance, her years of intimidation, all stripped away in a single night. She left the room in silence, her footsteps echoing against the floor. Her legacy nothing more than whispers of corruption and failure. The HOA, broken and leaderless, dissolved shortly after. Without its figurehead, without the trust of the community, it had no power left. Homeowners voted to dismantle the structure, choosing instead to govern themselves through cooperation and mutual respect. The age of fines, threats, and petty control was over. For the neighborhood, it was liberation. For the mechanic, it was simply another day. He returned to his garage, to his tools and engines, to the steady rhythm of work that had always defined him. He had never sought war, never chased revenge. All he had done was live with patience, respond with precision, and let arrogance destroy itself. In the weeks that followed, life in the neighborhood changed. Without the HOA's shadow, families relaxed. Kids played freely, decorations bloomed on lawns, and conversations carried laughter instead of whispers. And through it all, The mechanic's driveway became a quiet symbol, not of defiance, but of resilience. Neighbors stopped by to thank him, to shake his hand, to tell him stories of how they too had once felt trapped by the board's power. They saw in him not just a man who fixed cars, but someone who had shown that control could be challenged, that arrogance could fall, and that patience could win. As for the former president, her downfall was complete. Stripped of authority, burdened by the costs of her failed schemes, she faded into obscurity. Pride had driven her to fight a battle she could never win, and in the end it left her with nothing. The mechanic's victory was not loud, not flashy, but it was absolute. He hadn't needed to shout or scheme. He had simply let time, truth, and the steady rhythm of engines do the work. And so the story ended where it began, in a driveway, with the click of a socket wrench and the hum of an engine brought back to life. The HOA had tried to break him with fines, with rules, with arrogance. Instead, they had broken themselves. Because in the end, power does not come from paper, from titles, or from threats. True power is quiet. It is steady. It is the ability to keep moving forward while others fall apart. And as the mechanic tightened the last bolt on his truck, wiping grease from his hands, he knew one thing with certainty. No board, no president, no fine could ever take that away. When you really stop to think about it, stories like this one are more than just neighborhood drama. They're reminders of how fragile power really is when it's built on control, intimidation, and arrogance. The HOA in this story thought they had everything locked down. They thought they could dictate every move, issue fines at will, and bully anyone who dared to resist. But what they didn't understand is that true strength doesn't come from titles, clipboards, or letters. It comes from persistence, patience, and the courage to stand firm when you know you're in the right. The mechanic never shouted, never broke down, and never fought fire with fire. Instead, he let his actions speak louder than anything the board could write on paper. He stood in his driveway, working on his truck, living his life, and proving through steady resilience that no amount of petty fines could break him. And in the end, the HOA destroyed itself, not because of some grand battle, but because arrogance will always collapse under the weight of truth. For the neighbors, it was a wake-up call. For the community, it was a moment of liberation. And for the HOA, it was a final lesson. Control only lasts as long as people allow it. Once the curtain is pulled back, once the lies and abuse of power are exposed, there's no going back. The mechanic didn't just win for himself, he won for everyone who had ever felt trapped, under the thumb of an HOA that had forgotten its purpose. So what can we take away from this? That patience can be more powerful than rage, that facts cut deeper than threats, and that sometimes the quiet strength of a single person can bring down an entire system built on fear. And now I want to hear from you. Have you ever faced a situation like this in your neighborhood, at work, or even in your personal life, where someone tried to use authority against you, only for it to backfire? Share your stories in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story and want more HOA drama, Karen meltdowns, and property dispute revenge tales, make sure to subscribe, hit the like button, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next upload. Because in the end, these aren't just stories, they're lessons. And sometimes the best revenge is simply standing your ground.